Let us pray. Our Father, keep us mindful of the special and unique opportunity we have to work for our constituents and for our province. And in that work, grant us strength and wisdom. Amen.
On a point of order, Mr. Speaker, I would like to request that the Honourable Minister of Hospitals withdraw his statement in question period yesterday that I was entirely mistaken in my preamble in view of the fact that I have the documents in my hand showing that there has in fact been a delay in the proposed schedule for designating hospitals.
On the point of order, Mr. Speaker, I'd be more than happy to debate with the honourable member whether in fact he was entirely mistaken. I also have several documents in my hand that would indicate that he was mistaken, and would be happy to provide them to the legislature.
Thank you.
Presumably we'll debate in room 312 after the question period, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. I hope you both will enjoy coffee shortly after the afternoon proceeds from question period. If we could continue with the business of the House, please.
Introduction of visitors.
Mr. Speaker, I am pleased to introduce in your gallery today the distinguished ambassador from Argentina to Canada, His Excellency and Mrs. Pullett, and I would ask that they rise and receive the warm welcome of the Assembly. Your Honor, Mr. Speaker,
My Lord. My God.
Oh, well. Mr. Speaker, I regret that I had indicated that His Excellency's wife was present with him, and that was not the case. I would, however, like to introduce another distinguished visitor in your gallery as well, and the distinguished Member of Parliament for Athabasca, Jack Shields, who is chairman of the Alberta caucus of the members of Parliament for the province of Alberta, all of which members are of the same party.
Presenting petitions. Reading and receiving petitions. Presenting reports by standing and special committees. Notices of motions. Introduction of bills. Tabling returns and reports.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to table the annual report of the Department of Municipal Affairs.
Introduction of special guests.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to introduce to you and through you to the members of the Assembly, Mr. Don Whitaker, Chairman of the Board of Governors of Lakeland College, headquartered in Vermilion. The recent growth of this campus and college is a credit to Don's tremendous work as chairman and is much appreciated. I would ask Don, who is seated in the members' galleries, to stand and receive the warm welcome of this House.
Mr. Speaker, it is with great pleasure for me today to introduce to you and through you to members of the Assembly a person who has been important to me all of my life, my brother. And with him in the members' gallery you will see a vision of Alberta's great future, my niece Andrea McCoy and my nephew Darren McCoy. I would ask them to rise and receive the warm welcome of the Assembly.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to introduce a constituent of mine to the Assembly, Kathy Kinsley from Bow Island, who is accompanied by her father, Alan Ing, which is a little bit difficult for me to introduce Mr. Ing, except that I ran against him in 1975 in the constituency of Cyprus. I don't know if I scared him or what, but he moved to Edmonton after that and become president of the NDP party. If the legislature would welcome Mr. Ing and his daughter, Kathy.
Ministerial statements. Oral question period.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to direct the first question to the Premier, and it flows from yesterday where he said that gas deregulation won't hurt our petrochemical industry because of our assured supply and proximity to feedstocks. Could the Premier indicate why the government supports gas deregulation, that is, abolishing the Alberta border price, when it is clear that the cheaper transportation cost advantage of moving Alberta gas to Alberta's petrochemical plants would not compensate for the prohibitive cost of moving our processed product to central Canadian and American markets?
Mr. Speaker, as I said yesterday, there are two main advantages that the petrochemical industry has in Alberta. One is that they are situated close to assured supply that is assured through the Energy Resources Conservation Board and the industrial development permits. Secondly, I said it was because we had low price for the feedstock, natural gas, and that we would make sure that both of those conditions continued. Mr. Speaker, that is the policy of the government, and that will happen.
Oh, that's very nice, Mr. Speaker. I can't see how you can have it both ways with deregulation and have the advantages also. But just to flow from that, Mr. Speaker, under deregulation, the provincial government would not be allowed to withhold gas feedstocks from any central Canadian buyer. My question is to the Premier, given that, what has led the Premier to conclude that our industry will have any particular advantage compared to the central Canadian industry?
Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Leader of the Opposition is incorrect. We can withhold gas because we have both in our legislation and in our leases the right to withhold gas, and we would do it if necessary. As I said earlier in the House, though, it's always been our policy position that having first ensured that all foreseeable needs for Albertans are taken care of, we are then prepared to allow exports out of our province to other parts of Canada. Secondly, if there is then all the foreseeable needs for Canadians taken care of, we cooperate with the federal government and allow exports out of our country to other nations. That, Mr. Speaker, through our legislation and our leases, will allow us to provide assured supply on a long-term basis to industries within this province.
Supplementary question, Mr. Speaker. That's been the case. That under deregulation, Mr. Speaker, that gas producers can make their own arrangements with any company they want anywhere in Canada. That's my understanding. Now, how can we still have those same controls that the Premier is talking about under those circumstances?
Because, Mr. Speaker, we must approve a gas removal permit from the province, and that gas removal permit is within the control of the provincial government. Having been approved by the ERCB, they cannot even allow it. They must recommend it to the Cabinet, and the Cabinet must then approve it. I can remember back in the years 1971, 72, 73, 74, where we refused to allow additional gas to leave the province until we felt we were getting adequate prices for it. And in those days, that pressure paid off, and we did get adequate prices, at which time we then allowed it to be removed.
Well, supplementary question, under a regulated market, I might point out, Mr. Speaker, that happened. But the question to the Premier, has the Premier consulted with gas producers to see what plans are in place to dump deregulated gas with large buyers in central Canada, and whether or not that will in fact give an extra price advantage to the central Canadian industry?
First, Mr. Speaker, the original statement of the Leader of the Opposition was not correct in this third supplementary. That was not in a period of regulated prices. It was a period before we brought in gas regulation. It was a period in which we had recommendations from the Conservation Board that we had gas that was surplus. We refused to allow that gas to leave the province until we received prices for it that we felt were fair value. Had nothing to do with price regulation. It was our belief that you are wasting a resource. You are wasting resource and when you sell it below value. Now, as far as whether companies in Eastern Canada will have an ability to outcompete companies in Alberta, we say no, they will not.
Member for West Loch Sturgeon.
Supplemental, Mr. Speaker, to the Premier. Am I to understand the Premier to say that he is going to use the fact that the gas companies have to have a surplus before it can be exported to force down the price so that the gas companies, in order to get a market, have to supply the petrochemical industry?
Well, that's not necessarily at all what I was saying, but it should, the member for West Loch Sturgeon should know, Mr. Speaker, that there has not been within the province a fixed price for gas. We did not pass any legislation that provided for fixing prices for gas within Alberta. There was an anomaly in the original arrangement struck with the petrochemical industry when they were starting up in this province, that they had to buy from shippers who had already paid a regulated price, and therefore they were forced to pay the regulated price. That is being changed. And some time ago, I wasn't here in the House, but the government moved to assist the petrochemical industry on a short-term basis to allow a subsidy that would allow them to actually buy or get their supplies at market price. In the future, they will be able to get it at market price, and I believe that in Alberta we will have the lowest prices as input for petrochemical industries anywhere in Canada.
Second main question, Leader of the Opposition.
I'd like to direct the second question to the Minister of Federal and Intergovernmental Affairs. Mr. Speaker, information has come to light today indicating that the Canadian government has agreed to allow the United States Air Force to do low-level flight testing of heavy bombers and fighter bombers over northern Alberta next year. My question is to the Minister, has the Alberta government been consulted by the federal government on this matter, and if so, what is the position of the Alberta government on this low-level testing?
Mr. Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition and I have both read the same story in the Calgary Herald, and I have requested the information from the Department of National Defence relative to the decision which has been taken. I point out to the Assembly that it is a federal matter, national defence, but in the case of any testing of a major nature which takes place in Canada, the federal government has consulted with the provinces directly involved, and that we will, as we have in the past, be assured that the federal government, in maintaining its obligations under either NATO or NORAD, advise the province relative to the time, place, and nature of military testing which may take place in this province. We have always received assurances that all precautionary measures are taken, and we have always in the past received reports on the events as they have transpired. I expect that that will be the case in the future, and I would point out as well that it is anticipated that these tests will take place at some considerable time in the future, and we expect that the Department of National Defence will cooperate once again with our government in a thorough and effective manner.
Well, supplementary question. I wasn't sure whether they'd been consulted or not by that answer, but apparently Northern Albertans are again going to be used as guinea pigs by the United States Air Force. My question is this simple. As leader of this Alberta government, why are we prepared to support this type of testing over our borders?
Well, Honourable Leader of the Opposition's indignation level seems to be rising But the fact of the matter is that it is a federal issue. The Department of National Defense is responsible for the defense of Canada, and we have an agreement which has been signed by the Government of Canada under the then leadership of the Prime Minister Trudeau, the most recent renewal, I understand, of the NATO agreement, and we respect the federal government's responsibility in that regard. I go on to point out that there are many examples of testing of weapons within Canada. In Alberta, the British Army Training Unit tests tanks. Thousands of British troops are flown into Alberta every year by the Royal Air Force. Thousands of German troops are flown into Manitoba every year to test weapons there. And I do not recall ever hearing the government of Manitoba object to that particular training exercise. We've been urged always to follow that example by the opposition. And, Mr. Speaker, we will do that in this particular case.
Now, remind them of the nuclear weapons free zone.
Mr. Speaker, the traditional red herring. Surely even this minister would recognize the difference between bringing people in trucks and having B-52 bombers flying at low levels. I'm sure he's aware of that. But my question is, to come back to his responsibility here, what assurance has the government received that these huge planes will in no way endanger public safety or the environment in northern Alberta?
Mr. Speaker, since the Honourable Leader of the Opposition prefaced his remarks with bringing a comment about bringing people into Canada in trucks, I would remind the Honourable Member that the testing that is done is with live weapons in Manitoba and in Alberta. In the case that has been mentioned, the airplanes, which I should point out as well, Strategic Air Command has been flying over Alberta and other parts of Canada now for many years. And that will be the case in the future. And I, for one, am grateful that we have the United States of America to defend us. And, Mr. Speaker, I welcome as well the participation of the British Army and the Federal Republic of Germany in their defense efforts as well to protect Canada, since in many ways we are unable to protect ourselves thanks to the attitude of some people in this country.
Mr. Speaker, I almost expected them to start singing the national anthem of the United States as he was going through. My question is this, so apparently a United States Air Force document requests a Canadian study on the potential environmental impacts of low-level flights. Clearly they see some problem for environmental problems. Is the Alberta government concerned about these same problems, seeing that the testing will be over Alberta, or is the government content to just continue to let Albertans be used as guinea pigs?
Speaker, as was the case with the issue of cruise missile testing, environmental impact studies were requested and obtained and made public. And I expect that the same procedures will apply in this particular case. We will certainly ask that of the Department of National Defense, and the new minister, Mr. Beattie, no doubt will reply in due course. And in any event, I would rather sing the Star-Spangled Banner than the Internationale.
Leader of the Liberal Party.
Supplementary, Mr. Speaker, to the party opposite's chief plumber there. I would like to ask him if the assurances that he has. I would like to ask him if the assurances that he has received for safety of Northern Albertans is the same assurances that he received before the last two missile crashes of the cruise missile.
Mr. Speaker, in neither case was any property damage done to either the property of Alberta. They can dish it, but they can't dish it out, but they can't take it, you know, and that's very interesting, Mr. Speaker. I'm very interested to see that. Such thin-skinned members. The answer is yes, Mr. Speaker.
Main question, member for Westlock Sturgeon.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask, through you, to the Honourable Premier, question that in view of the tremendous loss of jobs in our oil industry and the possible near collapse of grain prices, and as chairman of this year's Premier's Conference scheduled here for August 11th and 12th, will the Premier reveal to the members of the legislature what items he has put on the agenda which addresses Alberta's economic concerns?
Mr. Speaker, as chairman of the conference, it is important that I go through the process of speaking to each of the various governments coming and make sure that their needs and wishes are incorporated into the agenda, and then work that in with Alberta's. I believe that shortly we'll be able to table for the members of the legislature the agenda for that conference, and hopefully they will agree with me that the agenda allows the opportunity to discuss all of the matters which he raised.
Mr. Speaker, to the Premier, that is good news indeed. Can he promise that one of the items, or the items that be listed would be energy and agriculture, free trade, three items that are very crucial for Alberta and beyond?
Mr. Speaker, I would give the assurance that the agenda will be styled in a way that would allow full discussion of all of those matters.
Mr. Speaker, to the Premier, can the Premier assure the legislature that he will not allow the constitutional concerns, as it's rumored now, to dominate the conference at the expense of Western economic concerns?
Yes, Mr. Speaker.
To Mr. Speaker, to the Premier, will the federal-provincial system of equalization grants, where Alberta now doesn't receive 1 penny, be on the agenda?
As I said earlier, it would not be in a specific notation, but the agenda will be styled in a way which would allow the discussion of those matters.
Supplementary, member for Clover Bar.
Mr. Speaker, to the Honourable Premier, I asked the question on the business transfer tax, and the Premier indicated that that would be a topic for discussion. Can the Minister or the Premier assures that that will want to be one of the main topics when we're looking at taxation, is the business transfer tax?
Mr. Speaker, I don't recall making that commitment that it would be on the agenda. It may be raised, Mr. Speaker, within the broad agenda items which we'll be discussing. I'm not sure if the honourable member was in the House when the provincial treasurer dealt with this matter in a little more detail, in which he mentioned that it had been raised with him in a meeting of provincial treasurers and the Minister of Finance, and that a paper would be distributed throughout Canada later this year, giving the details of the federal government's thinking with regards to that tax. However, it will not be as a specific item on our agenda, but the agenda is being prepared in a way which would allow the ability to raise that matter.
Supplementary, member for Edmonton Norwood.
Mr. Speaker, dealing with free trade, will there be a preliminary report? I know it's to come later, but some idea from Mr. Reisman about what's been put on the table in terms of his talks and the free trade talks?
Hear, hear.
I would not expect from Mr. Reisman, Mr. Speaker, because this is not a federal provincial meeting. This is just the 10 premiers meeting. And while trade will be one of the matters on the agenda, I do not anticipate that we'd invite Mr. Reisman to this one.
Main question, Leader of the Representative Party, followed by the member for Wainwright.
Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Environment. I'd like to ask the Minister whether the Minister or the Alberta Special Waste Management Corporation, in discussions with Bull Valley Resources, have determined the economic rates to be charged by the Swan Hills plant for the disposal of various wastes.
Mr. Speaker, the principles for a proposed agreement that were made public in March of 1986 talked about several types of rates that would be incorporated into the whole structure. One of the difficulties that exists right now is an attempt to quantify the amount of waste that would find its home in Swan Hills. The honourable member realizes that one of the provisions that exists under the objectives of the Alberta Special Waste Management Corporation is the provision that will allow a generator of waste to neutralize waste on site. Now, we have no idea of knowing at this point in time exactly how many firms in the province of Alberta might take that initiative, as opposed to how many firms in total would want to send the waste to Swan Hills for neutralization. And until we get a handle on that, it would be difficult to really determine what the cost factor would be for a pound or a ton or whatever amount of waste that would be going there.
Mr. Speaker, supplementary question to the Minister. The Minister, in his response the other day, indicated that all that was necessary to finalize the agreement was dotting the I's and crossing the T's. My question to the Minister, Mr. Speaker, is, under those circumstances, how can an agreement be finalized when the rates to be charged and the guarantee of rate of return to the company can't be determined at this time?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the questions raised of me today had to do with the rates that would be charged in terms of the transportation of waste. The discussion that we had several days ago had to deal with the rate of return from the investment with respect to the plant. They're two separate items.
Mr. Speaker, supplementary question to the Minister in light of what he just said. The Minister indicate when the final agreement may be signed. Are we closer to that agreement at this time, or is that sometime later into the fall? And I ask the question in light of the fact that the proposed opening date of the plant was in 1986.
I'm not aware, Mr. Speaker, that the proposed opening date of the plant was ever in 1986. I participated in the announcement several years ago with the then Minister of the Environment, and the time and the date that we always used was 1987. But in terms of dealing with the agreement that is currently being reviewed by myself, as each day goes on, I get closer to feeling more comfortable with my understanding and knowledge of it. And I would certainly hope that given the next several months and by the conclusion of this session that we will have it wrapped up.
Supplementary question, the Minister.
Well,
we have.
But I understand that, but it should be given by your leader. I'm sorry. Does he wish to? Thank you. Thank you. And then I recognize then the member for Edmonton Meadowlark. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's clear that the economics of the Swan Hills Waste Management Plant could involve importing dangerous goods, hazardous waste from across this country into this province. Earlier, the Minister, several weeks ago in the House, said that he had put a moratorium on that. Could he please assure the House that moratorium means never?
Mr. Speaker, there is a moratorium currently in place with respect to the importation of special waste from other jurisdictions in the province of Alberta. Never is one of those words that is rather finite. I have no idea what government there may be in the province of Alberta in the year 2030 or 2040 or 2050, and I certainly could not make a commitment in 1986 for the type of government or the direction it would want to provide to the people of Alberta at that period of time.
Supplementary, member for Edmonton Glengarry.
Thank you. In view of the present economically non-viable position, as was just outlined, can the Minister guarantee that Alberta will never become in our desire to make it viable, never become the site of environmentally unsound businesses, or that his department and his government will never consider the importing of waste from other provinces?
To the latter part of the question, that's certainly our intent, Mr. Speaker. I think it's important in responding to the member from Edmonton Glengarry that he should appreciate that our commitment, the government that I'm a member of, and the commitment of this government, is to improving and cleaning up the environment in the province of Alberta. And it should it be necessary for us to take steps and initiatives to, in fact, subsidize the transportation of those deplorable wastes that are located in some parts of Alberta to Swan Hills, that it may be necessary for us to do that. Now, if the honourable member would then argue that that would make the plant uneconomic, I would suggest to him that we're on the basis of an excellent debate. Our objective, our purpose for being is to improve the quality of the environment in this province, and we are determined to do that.
Member for Wainwright, followed by the member for Edmonton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Attorney General. In regards of the labour dispute at Fletcher's and Gaynors and the violence along the picket lines, I and the constituency of Wainwright are deeply concerned with the safety of the public on both sides of this dispute. Could the minister advise if there's been any criminal charges laid?
Mr. Speaker, there have been a number of criminal charges laid in connection with both disputes which have been mentioned in the question. I think it's important, though, to point out that the number of criminal charges that have been laid are relatively small in number compared to those complaints that have been laid against individuals for breach of the civil injunction against picketing. And I think it's perhaps useful to point out that fewer than 10% of the total number of complaints are in fact of a criminal nature, as judged by the police authorities as being in fact violations of the Criminal Code of Canada. I think in the case of Fletcher's, there were only 6 criminal charges laid, and as members are no doubt aware, 127 civil complaints under the injunction were dealt with in the Court of Queen's bench yesterday. In the case of Gaynors, I think it is just over 400 offenses of the injunction have been complained about by Gaynors, and of those, none have yet been adjudicated by the courts, and of those, only 30, I think, are repeat offenders in the view of the owner of the property. So, yes, criminal charges have been laid, but in the total context of the number of complaints, they are relatively few in number.
Supplementary then, the repeat offenders, have there been many repeat offenders with the charged with criminal offense?
With respect to the criminal offenses, Mr. Speaker, I am not aware, and I can take that question with notice, of people being charged repeatedly with criminal offenses, although there may be some individuals who, as a result of their conduct, may have been charged with more than one offense arising from the same occurrence. But I repeat, it is important to make the very real distinction between a charge under the criminal code and a complaint made as a result of an alleged violation of a civil injunction. And in that respect, as I've indicated, the number of criminal offenses are few.
Supplementary question, member for Edmonton Norwood.
To the Premier, to get to the real problems, the Premier said that he's reviewing the labor laws, and we're told that at the start of the session. Could he update us now and tell us if this has gone any further and when we might expect some approach to reviewing the labor laws?
Shortly, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Edmonton Centre, followed by the member for Edmonton Meadowlark.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would first like to congratulate the Minister of Hospitals and Medical Care for his announcement last Friday to finally begin the redevelopment of the Alberta Hospital Ponoka. But such announcements alone continue a disturbing trend, which is that far more healthcare dollars are spent on institutions than on community-based hospitals and care. Given this imbalance in the amounts of spending, is the minister carefully consulting with the Minister of Occupational and Community Health to provide a comprehensive mental health care in this province?
Mr. Speaker, it's always a challenge for our society to provide the kind of health care for mental patients that the honourable member suggests. And as I said yesterday in the question period, there needs to be a good balance between institutional care, between the involuntary patients being in places like Ponoka and the Alberta Hospital here in Edmonton, and in community-based hospitals, and in treatment in their own community. So I have no argument whatsoever, Mr. Speaker, with the honourable member's suggestion that our society, our community, our government ought to continue moving in the direction that has been pointed out by my predecessor and by others in the field of mental health toward community-based services, treating people in their homes, with their friends, and with their families. That's by far the best route to go.
Given that, however, currently in the province there's nearly a 50% rate of rehospitalization of mental health patients, what more specific programs can the government be doing to alleviate this high rate of rehospitalization?
Well, the honourable minister responsible for community health may wish to supplement my answer, but I believe that we have been moving in a very positive way in terms of providing health care in this province to mentally ill people that will see that reduced rate, that rate reduced substantially. When I was in last Friday in Ponoka, I was given to understand by the executive director of that hospital and his staff that the length of time at which people are hospitalized at that hospital has decreased dramatically over the past few years. Also, the incidence of people returning to be hospitalized a second time has decreased. So I think we're making good progress, but it may be that there's other information that the honourable minister responsible for community health could provide.
Well, Mr. Speaker, amongst the various services that the mental health patients are treated to in this province, whether it's through hospitals, whether it's through extended care centers, whether it's through community or community outreach programs, we are attempting, as the minister has suggested, to deliver a comprehensive system of mental health care delivery. And that's as the minister has mentioned, the statistics show that we are one of the leaders in this country in that field. And the commitment is there, and we will continue to deliver that, continue to do our very best to upgrade that, and that's the commitment we can make.
Well, let's get specific. Mr. Minister of Occupation and Community Health, what specifically programs have you got in place to address the glaring lack of adequate housing for ex-psychiatric patients who are otherwise dumped downtown around Boyle Street? What are you doing about housing for them?
Well, Mr. Speaker, through following discharge, a carefully planned discharge from all of our institutions, those people are then returned to the community where they are most comfortable. They're in the surroundings, the familiar and comfortable surroundings, hopefully of their own home, and that is where those kind of activities take place. Now, Mr. Speaker, when a patient leaves a health facility, whether it's Alberta Hospital Ponoka or Alberta Hospital Edmonton or any other facility, the services that patient wishes to take up are of his own choosing or of her own choosing, and it becomes then the right of the patient to decide the kind of care that he wants to take, and whether they return, Mr. Speaker, to the place to other places is an option to them, but the services are there within the community for them.
Well, certainly the state of the art in the whole area, it was commissioned, or was the review of the Mental Health Act by the Drury Commission. When is the minister is responsible finally going to bring forth some legislation based on the recommendations of Drury to amend the Mental Health Act as it should be amended?
Mr. Speaker, first of all, there's a great deal that can and has been done with respect to new directions in in mental health care arising from the Drury report that doesn't require legislation. In fact, most of the recommendations with respect to the care of mentally ill does not necessarily require legislation. But I should say that we presently are considering a draft bill with respect to a new Mental Health Act. It's my hope, depending on how long this session lasts, that we might table it during the course of this session, or perhaps this fall at least. It would then be our intention to have public discussions on the bill after it's received first reading, and probably pass it at another session of the legislature. I don't believe personally that it's so urgent to have a new Mental Health Act in Alberta that we ought to proceed with it without everyone having an opportunity to pass judgment on the contents of what we propose. So I would hope to have that here sometime either during this session or the fall session of the legislature.
Member for Cypress Redcliffe was on his feet before, and then.
Mr. Speaker, to the Minister of Community Health, could the Minister inform the House of the number of group homes that are involved in providing service to patients released from either any of the facilities that handle people with mental health problems? And in addition, could the Minister also inform the House of how many applications are before the Department by either individuals or community-based groups asking to provide additional services?
Are you surprised? Mr. Speaker, I'd have to take the latter part of the question as notice, but I can tell honourable members, Mr. Speaker, that there are any number of facilities in addition to Alberta Hospital, Edmonton, and Ponoka that we have in this province in Camrose, in Claresholm, and in Raymond, some 550 beds, facilities for 550 patients that are in need of those services. As well, through some number of programs, we provide over 600 residential spaces and some 500 day program spaces for those patients in need of the service. But as for the second part of the question, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to take that as notice.
Final supplementary, member for Calgary-Buffalo.
This will be easy, Mr. Speaker, after that hot potato. To either of the ministers, does the government have any concrete plans to improve the treatment of the mentally ill in community facilities, or are they going to leave the schedule to local institutions as they apparently plan to do in the case of hospitals making the decisions with respect to treatment of those who are involuntarily committed?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the honourable member does not have a copy. I guess he does have a copy, perhaps, but maybe hasn't referred to it, of what has now been approved as a policy with respect to the designation of active treatment hospitals throughout this province for the treatment of involuntary patients. I should add that there are a good number of hospitals in our province who have been for some time treating voluntary patients in the field of mental health and doing a very adequate job, and have psychiatric wards and services and personnel that are doing that. While I'm on my feet, Mr. Speaker, I could clear up the mystery surrounding the honourable member's confusion about the policy with respect to the designation of certain hospitals by simply saying this, and I would provide copies of it for the Assembly later on. About April 1985, a draft policy with respect to the designation of active treatment hospital facilities in Alberta was released by the Department for discussion purposes. It had certain schedules outlined in it with respect to the designation of hospitals, and hospitals and other healthcare professionals were asked to comment upon that draft policy. They did so over the course of the next several months, and that finally resulted in a revised draft that was then forwarded to my predecessor as Minister of Hospitals and Medical Care and approved as government policy earlier this year. The results of the review were a substantial number of changes from the original draft until the final policy that was approved by the Minister. In summary, Mr. Speaker, there has been no change whatever in the government's timeline with respect to the designation of active treatment hospitals for the reception of involuntary patients. The member happened to have in his possession a draft policy statement that didn't have attached to it a letter which went to all healthcare institutions who were involved, clearly indicating that it was a draft.
The chair understands that this information is going to be tabled with the House.
On a point of order, we are having discussions about precisely this matter. I resent it when the minister tries to get it in at the end of the question over something we've been trying to work out among House leaders.
Chair concurs. Member for Edmonton Gold Bar, followed by the member for Edmonton Kingsway, if we have time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To the Minister of Hospitals and Medical Care, on the same subject, Mr. Minister, will the Minister be acting on the recommendation of the jury report to provide both legal and non-legal advocacy services for involuntary mental patients?
Mr. Speaker, that's a matter that I would be fully prepared to discuss when we've had an opportunity to complete our review of the draft of the Mental Health Act and table it in the legislature. I think that's an important part of the whole question of how we handle involuntary patients, but I would prefer to first of all make our government's position known on that through the tabling of a new Mental Health Act.
Mr. Speaker, I suggest it needn't wait for that, and it's pretty important to do now. Supplementary, Mr. Speaker, to the Minister of Occupational Health. Children's welfare is now in the jurisdiction of social services, and mental health is in your jurisdiction, as I understand, Mr. Minister. I would like to know from you if it includes mental health treatment and care of children, and what steps you will take to ensure that children who are in child welfare jurisdiction have access to mental health services.
Mr. Speaker, I believe it to be more appropriate for this minister to answer the question, because the Child Welfare Act is under the Department of Social Services, and that includes looking after the mental health areas as may be appropriate for children who are in our care. There will be a working relationship with the department that the other honourable minister is responsible for in community and occupational health, and the required number of beds that we will need in possibly institutions or homes that are operated by the other department will be looked after probably on a contract basis, but with a certain amount of expertise provided by the other department. Those types of negotiations will go on, Mr. Speaker, and will be handled in the best interests of the children, depending on what part of the province we're speaking to.
Mr. Speaker, to the Minister of Social Services, do I understand then, Madam Minister, that all children's mental health services will remain in your jurisdiction?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, in terms of responsibility.
Mr. Speaker, a final supplementary to the Minister of Hospitals and Medical Care. Will the Minister be recommending to the Legislature that the Ombudsman's jurisdiction be extended to include all institutions designated now or in the future to treat involuntary mental patients?
Mr. Speaker, that again is a subject that's presently under discussion, and the honourable member would have to await our completion of the review of a new Mental Health Act and the tabling of that in the legislature.
Member for Edmonton Kingsway.
Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Consumer and Corporate Affairs. The Alberta Securities Commission has granted yet another extension to Northwest Trust and Heritage Savings Trust to file their financial statements. Could the Minister confirm that this will be absolutely the final extension to be granted?
Mr. Speaker, I had occasion on an earlier day to speak about the jurisdiction of the Alberta Securities Commission, and let me reiterate that it is a quasi-judicial, independent tribunal which deals with matters that are brought before it on a case-by-case basis, and the member opposite is misleading the Assembly by the very nature of his question.
Supplementary. Mr. Speaker. Surely the minister needs to take some responsibility for the Securities Commission.
Yeah.
Would the minister at least indicate what possible reasons there are for these extensions, because it is creating quite a lot of concern in the
Mr. Speaker, I would like to refer the member opposite to the public record, which is to say a decision of the Securities Commission.
Oh, boy.
Supplementary, Mr. Speaker, and if the Consumer and Corporate Affairs...
Excuse me. The chair reminds the honourable member that indeed we have enough references here about semi-judicial boards that the member is in some danger. So the chair would recognize another supplementary in this issue, but it must be carefully crafted. Excuse me.
Mr. Chairman, that Securities Commission, we've had much debate with the previous minister. It clearly falls under her jurisdiction. Whether she uses it as a quasi-legal thing or not, it's still responsible to that minister.
On the point of order, the chair will take it under consideration, but again, the chair would remind the member who raises the point of order that this is the 21st legislature, not the 20th. But I will take it under consideration.
Supplementary, Mr. Speaker, and it is in a slightly different line. So, but if this minister can't answer the question, then perhaps the treasurer would like to try this one. Yes. Can the minister indicate what financial commitments the Alberta government or the Treasury branches have to Northwest Trust beyond the Treasury branch's guarantee of $85 million in shares?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the matter of commercial agreements between a corporation such as any private corporation or public corporation trading here in the Treasury branches is a matter of private information, and I'm not about to reveal the commercial transactions which take place between the Treasury branches and any corporation in Alberta.
So we will take it then that the total commitment of the Alberta government is $85 million. After all, it is taxpayers' dollars, and the taxpayers should know how much is the commitment.
Honourable member, I ask you that when we come to supplementary questions, it's one question. It has no preamble. It's the main question that carries the preamble of one or two or three carefully crafted sentences with comment. But when we get to the supplementaries, it's the bare bones question, please.
Point of order, if I may. You allowed, Mr. Speaker, the minister to sneak around and answer to the honourable member's question over here, and there was no intervention by the chair. And one extra preamble on the opposition side, and you're interjecting. I think there has to be fairness here.
With due respect to the Honourable Leader of the Opposition, if you care to check answered, you'll see that is a little bit skewing what indeed happened this afternoon. I would think that the Honourable Member would also take into consideration that the Chair made the request of the Minister to file the documents. When the Honourable Leader of the Opposition also then made a similar comment, the Chair said, I concur with the comments made by yourself. That's an entirely different thing than what you have just said. If the House would like me to jump in much more rapidly, I'll do it on everyone starting tomorrow, and it will also include the Leader of the Opposition. Supplementary member for...
What evidence does the minister have that the commitment of taxpayers' money involved with Northwest Trust and Heritage Trust will not end up following the route of the millions of dollars that were given away in the failed bailout of the Canadian Commercial Bank?
Final supplementary, member for Edmonton Meadowlark.
Mr. Speaker, if you're going to start jumping in, could you please start after this question? Since the minister is not responsible, as she's established, for the brokerage industry in this province, could you please tell the House who is responsible for the brokerage industry policy and its role in a coordinated financial strategy for this province?
Mr. Speaker, again, the members opposite are not understanding the nature of the legislation that has been set up in this province and is working very well. And again, I refer them to the statutes of Alberta.
Might we revert briefly to the introduction of guests?
Seated in the members' gallery are two young women that literally control and rule my life. I'm proud to introduce to you and to all members of the Assembly my constituency secretary, Lottie Germanick, and my Edmonton secretary, Barbara Jones. And I better hurry up, they're leaving to beat the Dickens. I would ask them to rise and receive the warm welcome of the House.
Orders of the day.